thank you very much. In terms of the synopsis, which is like the executive summary, like the book says, it's called Outliers, the Story of Success. It was first published in 2008. Just from what I surmise, the purpose of the book was just to examine successful people and look beneath the surface, and it points out certain things, just through good storytelling that have helped successful, sort of people that have achieved what you might call extraordinary success, being, the help they got from other people, practice, and making the most of opportunity, and one of the conclusions you reach from reading this book is that there is no such thing as a self-made man. People succeed, particularly when you're talking about major success, it happens in context. And the book has two sections. The first part is called Opportunity, and we'll go through it in the chapters. And the second part is called Legacy. Now, the Opportunity part has 5 chapters. The Legacy part has 4 chapters. And basically, the 6 main things that contribute to extraordinary success or outliers, he points out, and I summarize them here. Opportunity is big, right? Opportunity is probably arguably the thing that captures it all. But the way to think about it is that he's making the strong case that it is almost better to be lucky or fortunate than just to be smart, and he tries to paint a picture throughout the book. And of course, timing. We say timing is everything. I learned that it was John Scully that first said this, the guy that used to be CEO of Apple back in the day. And then he talks a lot about upbringing, just the context in which we are raised. And the way to think about it is that nurture trumps nature. In other words, how people are nurtured and raised is almost more important. In fact, it's more important than the IQ. A lot is said about IQ and being very smart, but it turns out that there are quite a few smart people out there. It's really the opportunities people get in terms of how they are raised that matters. Then the 10,000 hour rule, which talks a lot about practice. Practice makes perfect. And the fact that you need 10,000 hours to gain mastery in any field, to be world class. And then he emphasizes the importance of meaningful work. And meaningful work doesn't mean, work that is high profile. In fact, you see that some of the best examples in the book were just work that you would consider mundane, but they had meaning. They influenced, the outcomes mattered to the people doing the work. And then he spent a lot, the second part of the book, talking about legacy, particularly around culture and values. And that values influence us much more than we think. People actually are shaped by their values and their circumstances more than we think. Let's go to the introduction, and then we'll just go from there. In the introduction, he starts with a mystery. I mean, this guy is a great storyteller, as you will know from reading this book and other books. He starts off with something he called the Rossetto mystery, which is basically a mystery around these people that lived in this small part of, I think it was in Pennsylvania, called Rossetto, and they all sort of emigrated or came from Italy, in a small town in Italy called Rossetto. And it turned out these guys were living longer, didn't have heart disease, didn't have any of these problems that plague modern society. And of course, most people would have assumed that it's because of their diet, exercise, genetics, but a particular sort of gentleman went and researched it. Somebody called Wolf went and studied why these people, Stuart Wolf, went and studied why were they, a physician, why were they living longer? And what he found, which was almost like uncovering the mystery, was that, this was a community that nurtured its people, a close-knit, harmonious, nurturing community. And as a result of that, community and how harmonious it was and how nurturing it was, these people actually, had better quality lives and lived longer. And then, of course, the Outliers man himself then wants to do for us. Malcolm Gladwell then says, I want to do for our understanding of success. This book is about success. What Stuart Wolf did for our understanding of health, making the point that, there is hidden mystery behind, it's not what you think that leads to success. And of course, it goes about it in a storytelling form that is quite captivating. And I'll just go through the chapters now. The first chapter, which he called the Matthew effect. Those of us that are students of the Bible will remember that passage from Matthew, where this Matthew effect came from, Matthew 25:29. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have abundance. But from those who do nothing, even the little they have will be taken away from them. And he basically used the story of sports, right? Particularly Canadian sports, and to be more precise, Canadian hockey. Canadians are known for ice hockey. And it turns out that in Canada, how they select, talent, how they select those that are talented that should go into the hockey program, it's actually skewed, because it turns out that like they start quite early, about when they're 9 or 10. And there, of course, what they then do is basically trying to see who is doing well at that level. But it's at that level, because they get into, the cutoff point is January 1. So somebody who is born January 2nd could easily have a year on somebody born on December 31st, and both of them will enter the same class on January 1, and they'll be called 1 year old or 0. And you can imagine at that level, that 1 year or a few months extra makes a lot of difference. And it turns out that most people who play in the top league in ice hockey in Canada were born in the early months of the year, January, February, March, because that little extra means a lot, because then the Matthew effect kicks in, what he calls the theory of accumulative advantage. Once a player is chosen, he gets better coaching, he gets more talented teammates, he gets better practice, and the advantage just keeps growing. This is an example of what we know as virtuous cycle. Because you have an advantage, you get even more advantage. A gentleman called Robert Merton, I think he's an economist, called it the Matthew effect. And of course, this is related to, this Matthew passage, in the sense that like it's almost as if like the advantage accumulates and disadvantage accumulates as well. Of course, this relates to other fields, like compound interest. This is how compound interest works. This is how habit works, just to bring it to our personal lifestyle. If you have a habit in an area, the more you do it, the better you get, the more you enjoy doing it, and the better you get, and the more the gap widens. No wonder Albert Einstein said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. The most important point to take away from this chapter is that almost all outliers in every field in human endeavor benefit from this phenomenon, whether it's music, sports, science, mathematics, and of course, Malcolm Gladwell goes on to show that this in the subsequent chapters. The next chapter, chapter 2, deals with the 10,000-hour rule. Here, Malcolm Gladwell actually gives us a hypothesis, which of course people have been challenging, but it's a very interesting one. He says 10,000 hours spent practicing or refining a skill will lead to mastery in that skill. You become world class in it. And he says it typically takes about 10 years, about 1,000 hours a year over 10 years. Sometimes people can put in that amount of time in less time. And then he goes on to look at some very interesting stories of people who benefited from this rule by, reason of their circumstances. Talked about Bill Joy, the founder of Sun Microsystems and the software engineer who grew up in Michigan, 70s. Talked about the Beatles and the experience just learning to play music in Hamburg, Germany. He talked about Bill Gates, that was really being in Seattle at the time when they had this supercomputer, when others didn't have access, and he just kept practicing and putting in 10,000 hours. That's how they became world class and just outliers in what they did. And then he deals with another dimension of success that is almost like this time in terms of timing, just dealing with this issue of timing and luck of when people were born. If you go and look at the 75 richest people in history, it turns out about 20% of them, about maybe 15 of them or so, were born around the same time in America, because it turns out that was when the Industrial Revolution, they grew up in the second half of the 19th century in the United States when the Industrial Revolution took off, and they were all industrialists and entrepreneurs, and they made a fortune. And he says that they were just lucky to be born at that time. And of course, he talked about the same thing happening with technology in the 20th century. Those born around 1950s America and grew up in the 70s when computer was taking off. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Bill Joy, they all grew up about the same time. And this is very interesting because he's trying to make the point again that context, timing matters, that all these things don't happen, that even when we talk about the so-called 10,000-hour rule, people have to get the opportunity to put in that time. Let me just bring it to a life of faith, since I know LATERNA came from a faith sort of history. When Paul tells us in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 15:10, it is by the grace of God I am what I am. And he says, I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God. The argument that Malcolm Gladwell is making is that Paul agrees that he had the opportunity to put in the time. Maybe there were others who didn't even get the opportunity to even put in that labor. But of course, when you get the opportunity to put in the labor, you can be an outlier, just like Paul. The Apostle Paul was an outlier in his generation, and even we still talk about him now. And all these gentlemen and women we've covered are all outliers. Chapters 3 and 4 get into a very important and interesting theme of geniuses. And if I wanted to just summarize, I would say that where he lands is that it's not enough to be a genius. In fact, he even goes further to say you don't even need to be a genius. And the way he proves this is by looking at two geniuses that grew up in America, or grew up about the same time. One was called Chris Langan and the other one was Robert Oppenheimer. Both of them were geniuses, but one had something that he called practical intelligence, knowing what to say to whom, knowing when to say it, and knowing how to say it, almost like being street smart. The other one was very bright, but not street smart. But this Robert Oppenheimer was very street smart. So street smart that when he had a bout of depression where he poisoned one of his colleagues, and somehow, fortunately, I hope the person didn't die, but he was then asked he had to come and basically defend himself. And he managed to talk himself into getting a slap on the wrist. Whereas this other gentleman, Chris Langan, who was also a genius, couldn't even retain a scholarship that he was given. And the point that Malcolm Gladwell makes in this book is that it's almost like we overrate geniuses. And too much is said about geniuses. He goes on to talk about the Ivy League schools to show that you need to be intelligent enough. But once you get to a particular level, really, all these other factors that we're talking about kick in. It's no longer about who is the smartest. Being smart is not enough. And in fact, you just need to be intelligent. You don't need to be the smartest of them all. But you'll find that the other factors contribute even more to success than just being a genius. He then goes on to prove this point by looking at other cases, and he looked at a gentleman called Joe Flom and dealt with 3 lessons from his life. Joe Flom is one of the most successful lawyers in America. He's a nameplate lawyer in one of the top law firms in New York, and it all started with a disadvantage. This gentleman, being Jewish, could not get into any of the top law firms. So he had to start doing the kind of work that the top law firms didn't do. Works around, buying, just basically raiding companies and trying to defend them, and instead of the blue chip work they did at the time. Well, as it turns out, that work eventually becomes very important work. And that's how this guy reaches the top. And then he gives some other examples also from his background where, 2 other lawyers as well who were Jewish also. One of them was the father of the other, born at the turn of the 19th century. The other one was born a little later in the 1930s. And he talks about, again, the luck of when you are born. The guy who was born in the 30s grew up when, after the Second World War, there was just less people. The population needed more. They needed more people, the boomers, the so-called boomers in America, to drive the economy, the industrial revolution or the industrial economy that took off. And therefore, the son of this other man, called Mott, ended up doing very well. Whereas the father was a so-so lawyer, very promising, but eventually didn't reach his full potential just because he was born more, he functioned more during the Depression in America, whereas the son functioned during the latter years when things were rosy. And then he goes to the garment industry also and shows again that this issue of, how we look at things as disadvantages can be an advantage. The garment industry in America, it turns out that a lot of them were immigrants from Poland, the Jewish again, but, the work they were doing to an outsider may have looked like drudgery and things that was, but it turns out that it was meaningful work. They enjoyed doing it. They were actually very well trained where they were coming from. And they dominated the fashion industry. And the argument that Malcolm Gladwell makes in the book is that it turns out that their humble origins and that hunger and that desire to succeed in America turned out to be an advantage, not a disadvantage. I'm sure you've had the same phenomenon with Nigerians who live in America now. I'm sure you know that Nigerians in diaspora in the US are doing very well. And it's back to this hunger to succeed. So what was meant to be a disadvantage can actually be an advantage, which is why when you find that the generations that succeed, some of those early generations at times actually struggle because they don't have the same, work doesn't have the same meaning for them. And the legacy part just tries to show that people's culture and ecosystem actually matters. He starts off with a very sad story, actually a horrendous story, something called that happened in Harlan, Kentucky, southeast United States, where, in the 19th century again, this community was at war. They were at war. They were having these bloody feuds over land. They lived in a very Spartan place in a hill country, and the families fought each other, and it was almost like a mafia type environment. But here is the interesting thing: more than 100 years later, generations that came down the line were still influenced by this. They still had that aggression. Those that came from there. He compared people that came from that part of the southeast to, say, Americans that came from the northeast when they were in college, and the way they responded to adversity and to challenges was dramatically different. And I think the point he's making here, just like to use a more obvious example, if you look at people who come from the Midwest America and those Midwestern values of, just being more conservative, more, you could even say more Christian to some degree, at least in the traditional sense, and, just having traditional values versus, say, New York, where, of course, it's big city and the big city syndrome. His point being that all these factors matter and shape who we are and shape what success eventually means. He goes on then to, bring it home with 3 other examples. One is, he looked at plane crashes and he called it the ethnic theory of plane crashes in chapter 7. There, the Korean Air, which was the South Korean airline, was having a lot of crashes in the 90s. One of them, he studied and just dealt with. It turns out that in that crash, the flight officer who noticed what was the problem, the ice that was accumulating, instead of saying this thing can lead to a plane crash, he just said to the captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot, as if because of the radar, maybe we might be able to cope with this. Of course, the plane eventually crashed, unfortunately. The same thing happened with Colombian Airline, where in effect they were trying to land in JFK in New York, but they were in New York, they're very plain spoken, whereas these guys are very deferring. And instead of stating bluntly that they needed to land and land quickly because they were running out of fuel, they kept using what he called mitigated speech. And believe it or not, they told them to go back and circle before coming back to land. And they went back to circle and the plane crashed because they ran out of fuel. And then they get into, why does this happen in certain cultures? And it turns out there's something called the power distance index, which is basically, how people respond to authority. And the theory here is that, he showed that this power distance index could be an issue where communication is important, like in the way I live with a life or death situation, where you just need to call a spade, where you don't need to mince words. So for instance, in Korean Air, they had to bring an American from Delta Air to retrain all their pilots and first flight officers, to call a spade, say what you mean what you say. And the crashes stopped. It just literally stopped. So again, he was just dealing with, look at that kind of success and what culture had to do with it. In chapter 8, it gets even more interesting, and he has this theory that there is a correlation between people who cultivate rice paddies and masters and how well they do in masters. And one of the proverbs from China where these rice paddies are cultivated, is that no one who can rise before dawn, 365 days a year, fails to make his family rich. And he's dealing with this issue of perseverance, hard work, and diligence. And the point here is that because those of them that cultivate these rice paddies, they develop a culture of paying attention to things. Because, you can't afford to get it wrong and persevering if you want to get the right yield for your crop. And the rice farmers, for them, this is real meaningful work. We talked about the concept of meaningful work when we were talking about Joe Flom earlier. And the amazing thing and the part that really made this very interesting was the correlation he found between people who do this kind of work, and those who do well in the math tests, all these math aptitude tests, say in America and elsewhere, and it turns out that the same hard work and the same attitude that you need to succeed at cultivating these rice paddies, the same attitude you need for maths. And just give you one example of it. The argument that the book makes, or he makes in this chapter, is that maths, it turns out, is actually a test of perseverance. We talk about perseverance a lot. And not so much, who has a higher IQ and has a maths aptitude in the abstract sense. He gave so many examples. There's an example where people who take time to finish the introductory questions they ask before you get into the actual test. He predicted who would do well in the test. Because the more people persevere, and this, of course, the argument being that this is true of life, that people who persevere generally tend to succeed, particularly when they have important opportunities where they can achieve outlying success or extraordinary success. So this book talks about this correlation between rice paddies and then the last chapter talked about just going back to education, the area of education and opportunity. And in America, they have these long summer vacations. And the interesting thing about these vacations is that it's supposed to allow the children to, refresh and refresh again to go back to school so they're not exhausted. But again, the author points out in America, the problem is actually the opposite, that during that summer vacation, because of the idleness of those who do not come from places where they keep them engaged, they actually fall back over time. Those that are, from families where they're very resourceful. One of the things I failed to mention when I talked about Chris Langan and Robert Oppenheimer is that Chris Langan came from, a poor family where there wasn't much engagement, whereas Robert Oppenheimer came from a family that engaged him. And it turns out that that engagement makes all the difference in terms of resourcefulness, in terms of people being able to cope with non-academic intelligence or issues of life. And the same thing they found in this so-called chapter 9, Marita's bargain, they call it. Marita is a young girl, 12-year-old girl, who transferred from one of the regular schools to this KEEP Knowledge is Power program, which is where they really work the students hard. She had to wake up by 5:45 a.m., get on the bus, get to school, come home maybe around 7-8 p.m., have dinner, then finish her work every day. And of course, she starts to perform. And the interesting thing about this KEEP program is that they don't even bother to do tests to admit them. They just pick the children by lottery. And when they pick them and then put them into this program, they all go on to do very well. So he was just trying to say it's again about opportunity, giving people opportunity. This idea that some people are smart, some people are not, it's actually more of a myth than reality. That is more of who had the better opportunity, the challenge of opportunity, versus just, some people being geniuses, self-made, and some of the other things we like to hype. And I think in summary, the book just is trying to make the point that there's too much emphasis put on the self-made man or the individual, and not so much on the society and the context, the environment, the ecosystem. And he concludes with his own story. He goes to look into his own history, digs into his own family background. What does he find? That his family, at least on the mother's side, were 2 generations away from being from slavery. In other words, the great-grandparents of the mother were slaves in Jamaica. And, it turns out again that the grandmother, Desi Nation, as she was called, really went out of her way to push her children to get good education. And then, of course, that led to the education of the mother, Joyce, who then, eventually married when she went to the UK, and that's how Malcolm Gladwell came to be. And his point again is that he came out of a combination of this opportunity, but the opportunity parents had. There are people who were stuck in Jamaica didn't get an opportunity. At this stage, the grandmother had to go and borrow from a shopkeeper, the Chinese shopkeeper, just to send the daughter to school, because the second daughter got a scholarship, but she didn't want to leave Malcolm's mother behind. And of course, that was her lucky break, and of course Malcolm is been phenomenally successful himself. So I thought I'll conclude. I know I've used all the time. I thought I'll conclude by just looking at some of my own reflections, personal reflections. One is that I agree with the author that there is no such thing as a self-made man. Context truly matters. Luck or good fortune and mastering opportunity are major contributors to success, particularly when you're dealing with the kind of extraordinary success that he wrote about. And it really comes to mastering opportunity or making the most of it by practice. In my family, the mantra is practice makes perfect. We believe that if you practice, you will do well. If I go further back to my nuclear family, before I got married and started raising my own family now, in my family, there was this thing he talks about, an environment that is conducive to learning, applies to us. My parents weren't rich. My father was a reverend clergyman, a minister, a pastor. My mother, worked in the civil service, but they had a huge interest in education. They valued education. They sacrificed for it. They had to borrow when they had to. And of course, we prayed a lot. And I believe prayers make a big difference. And of course, going on now, myself and my wife, we are also forming that kind of partnership, in raising our children, because it really is creating that conducive environment for children to grow up and for families to succeed. And if I look at my own life and the lucky breaks I had, how I did that for Anderson and crossed over from medicine, I literally stumbled upon it when I went to see my sister who was working in USC at the time. I have a friend called Chijoke Uzo who introduced me to Harvard Business School. That's how I ended up going to the school, And the final thing I would say is that even the adversity I faced, for instance, when I worked in South Africa, I had some challenges with my colleagues at work, but that's what pushed me to decide to come back and indulge in the entrepreneurial effort of being part of those that started African Capital Alliance. So my conclusion is many people who leave organizations to found businesses are pushed or propelled by adversity. This idea of a hidden opportunity that is masked by adversity or by the challenges we see. I'm sure you've heard that thing that disappointments are blessings in disguise. So with that, I will stop and say that concludes the review of the book. Thank you very much.